We go moving on with the Unit 9 exercise answers. And in these exercises, we're going to be dealing with asset exchanges. And the big thing to track when you're exchanging assets is, does this exchange have commercial substance or does it not? In other words, after we exchange one asset for the other, is it going to have some kind of material effect on our cash flows? Are we going to be more profitable? Are we going to be able to operate cheaper? Are we getting out of payments that we owed on the old asset that we are exchanging? Is something happening that's materially changing the cash flows and the makeup of our business? If there is, we have commercial substance, which means if there's a gain or a loss, it doesn't matter. We get to recognize it immediately. If it, however, lacks commercial substance, so it's not going to have a material effect on our business operations, we have to ask ourselves, are we getting cash or are we not getting cash? If we're not getting any cash in the transaction, in the exchange, then we can still recognize all the losses immediately if there is one. But if there's a gain, we have to defer that gain. We can't recognize the gain at the time that it's exchanged. If cash was received, we can still recognize all the losses immediately. So it doesn't matter what happened. If you have a loss on an exchange, you can always recognize that loss at the time. But if cash was received in the transaction, you can recognize the gain, but you can't recognize the whole gain. You can only recognize the portion of the gain which is equal to the portion of the total compensation you received that came in the form of cash. So another example here, say that you had a $10,000 gain and half of what you got was in the form of cash. So that means you can recognize half the gain. So you'd only be able to recognize $5,000. And you need to defer the remaining gain. And you'll see this work its way through in the following examples. In the first one, we have that on October 31st, Jarhead Jelly Company is going to trade a used canning machine to XYZ Company, and this exchange has commercial substance. Boom, right there we know we can recognize all the gains if there is one, and it doesn't matter with losses, we'd always recognize the loss in full at the time of exchange if there was one. This used machine has a historical cost of $30,000. It is accumulated depreciation of $14,000 and has a fair value at the time of this exchange of $18,000. The new machine that we're acquiring from XYZ Company has a list price of $25,000. And XYZ is going to give Jarhead a trade-in allowance of $9,500. So they're taking $9,500 off of list price because Jarhead is trading in a used piece of equipment. What we need to do is we need to figure out what the cost basis of our new asset is so we can figure out if there's a gain or a loss, and we can record the journal entry. So the cost of the new asset is the fair value of everything that you are giving up to acquire this asset. Well, let's figure out what we're giving up. This machine that we are acquiring from XYZ Company lists for $25,000, but they are giving us a trade-in allowance of $9,500. They're taking $9,500 off of the price because we are exchanging our used canning machine with them, which means since they're giving us $9,500 off, we only have to pay them $15,500 in cash to acquire this new machine. We're also giving up that used canning machine, and when you figure out the cost of any asset being acquired, it's the fair value of what you're giving up. So even though we have a historical cost and an accumulated depreciation for that canning machine on our books, what we're concerned with is that fair value of $18,000. So we're giving up $15,500 in cash. Cash is always at fair value. The fair value of the machine that we're giving up is $18,000, which means our cost basis in this new machine we are acquiring is $33,500. Because that is the fair value of everything we gave up to acquire it. Now we got to figure out if there's a gain or a loss on the disposal of that canning machine that we're trading in. The canning machine had a historical cost of $30,000. It had accumulated depreciation of $14,000, which means its book value on our books say that machine was worth $16,000, but we didn't get $16,000 worth of value when we traded it in because the fair value we've already determined was $18,000, which means since our book value was only $16,000, we got $2,000 more in buying power than our book said that used canning machine was worth. Well, that's our gain. We're getting more for it than our book said it was worth. We have to recognize that somewhere. So we're going to call that a gain on asset disposal of $2,000. And because this has commercial substance, we know we can recognize that gain in its entirety at the time of the exchange. So let's make that happen. On December 31st, when this transaction goes through, we're going to put on the books what we're receiving. And what we're receiving is that new piece of equipment, which we already determined had a cost basis of $33,500. So we're going to put the new machine on the books. We need to take the old machine off the books. Well, the old machine had accumulated depreciation of $14,000, and since that's a contra asset account, which usually has a credit balance, to take it off our books, we need to debit it. So we're going to debit the accumulated depreciation account of the piece of equipment that we're exchanging to take it off our books. We had a gain in this instance, and gains get increased on the credit side, so we're going to recognize our $2,000 gain under gain on asset disposal. We already took the accumulated depreciation for our equipment off the books. Well, we got to take the actual piece of equipment off the books, and it was being carried at a historical cost of $30,000. So we take the equipment off at its historical cost. And the last thing that we have to make note of is how much cash we're actually handing over to acquire this machine. We paid $15,500 in cash to acquire that new machine after we got our trade-in allowance. So this is all of the stuff that changed hands during the transaction. We exchanged assets with XYZ company, and again, we recognize the $2,000 gain in full at the time of exchange because this exchange had commercial substance. It is going to have some kind of significant change on Jarhead Jelly Company's operations, on their cash flows in the future. Another example in exercise 2 is that Master Blaster Fabricators exchanged a used laser cutter, and this laser cutter has a book value of $112,000, which consists of $140,000 historical cost and $28,000 in accumulated depreciation. So our books say that this laser cutter that we are exchanging is worth 112 grand, but its fair value is actually 119,000. We're going to exchange it to Steelworks in exchange for even fancier model, this time a water jet cutter. So in addition to this laser cutter, Master Blaster, that's us, is going to pay Steelworks a boot of $7,000. And what the phrase boot means is that's cash that gets exchanged during a transaction to make both parties whole. If one talk used cars here. If somebody had a used car was worth $9,000 and they wanted to trade it to someone else with a used car worth $10,000, well, that's not a fair swap. But if the person with the $9,000 used car throw in $1,000, well, then both people would be getting $10,000 worth of assets in the exchange, so it becomes fair. So that difference to make the fair values of things equal is called the boot. So in this case, our company, Master Blaster, is going to pay Steelworks, who are getting this water jet cutter from, an additional $7,000 to make this transaction fair for both parties. And this transaction has commercial substance, which means we get to recognize any gain that happens in its entirety at the time of exchange. So just like we did before, we need to figure out what the fair value of everything we're giving up in order to acquire this machine is. Well, we're giving up that laser cutter, and that laser cutter had a fair value of $119,000. We're also giving up $7,000 boot payment to make this deal whole. So cash is always at fair value. We're giving up $7,000 in boot cash exchanged, which means we're giving up $126,000 worth of assets to acquire this water jet cutter from Steelworks. Are we going to have a gain or a loss? Well, what we got rid of was a $140,000 historical cost laser cutter, which had accumulated $28,000 worth of depreciation, which means its value on our books is $112,000. But its fair value is $119,000, which is greater than our book value by $7,000. So we're getting $7,000 more in buying power from this laser cutter we're exchanging than our books say that it's worth, which means we need to recognize it as a gain. And because we have commercial substance, we get to recognize it in full. So we're going to run through the same exact steps that we had a minute ago. On November 30th, we are acquiring a new piece of equipment, and that new piece of equipment has a cost, everything we gave up to get it, of $126,000. We need to take the accumulated depreciation of our old piece of equipment off the books. That was at $28,000. And we had a gain, which because there's commercial substance, we get to recognize in full. So that's going to be $7,000. And then we're going to take the old piece of equipment that we are exchanging, our laser cutter, off of the books. It had a historical cost on our books of $140,000. And is any cash changing hands? It sure is. There was a $7,000 boot involved in this transaction. We exchanged assets with Steelworks. So what happens here if instead we take that same transaction, but this time we assume that it lacks commercial substance, which means it's not going to have a material effect on our company's cash flows? Well, if that happens, we've got to defer the gain. We can't recognize it at the time. And it's actually a pretty simple process. See, all you do is when you put that piece of equipment on your books, instead of putting it on at the total cost, total fair value of everything that you gave up to acquire it, figure out what your total compensation given up was, in this case $126,000, and you subtract out the gain. Our gain was $7,000, which means we're only going to put this on the books for $119,000. Why do they call it deferring a gain? Because we're putting this equipment on our books for less of a value than it is actually worth. So at some point later down the future, when we dispose of this piece of equipment somehow, it's more than likely we're going to have to recognize a gain then. So we're just pushing that $7,000 gain into the future until the next time we have a transaction which involves this piece of equipment that we are acquiring. Everything else in this transaction is exactly the same. We are taking the old piece of equipment off our books, both its historical cost and its accumulated depreciation, and we're going to decrease our cash account by that $7,000 amount of boot. We exchange assets with Steelworks. Exercise number 3. On December 1st, Axe House is going to trade a collection of used tools with a total book value of $80,000, which is a $200,000 historical cost, plus $120,000 in accumulated depreciation. And they're going to exchange those to acquire a hydraulic press from Hughes Tool Company, which has a fair value of $84,000. So in this instance, Axe House, the tools that we're giving up, yes, they are on our books for $80,000, but as the information tells us, they have a fair value of $96,000. That's how much these things are worth on the open market. Well, this hydraulic press we want to get from Hughes Tool Company only has a value of $84,000. And why we want to give up $96,000 to acquire $84,000, that's not fair to us. So, assuming Hughes Tool Company initiated this exchange, we said to them at the time of the transaction, sure, we'll make the trade, but we're giving up more than we're getting back. Why don't you throw in cash equal to the difference? Since ours is worth $96,000 and theirs is worth $84,000, that's a $12,000 difference. Why don't you throw in $12,000 in cash, and this trade will be fair. So we are receiving the boot this time. This transaction lacks commercial substance. And now is where things get complicated. It lacks commercial substance. And when it lacks commercial substance, you have to figure out, are you receiving cash in the transaction or are you not? Well, we're Axe House, and we are. We're receiving $12,000 in boot, so yes. Which means we get to recognize the gain, but we can't recognize the whole gain. We can only recognize a portion of the gain that is equal to the portion of the total compensation that we received in cash, or the portion of the value of everything that we got, which came in the form of cash. And we'll break that down right now. So the fair value of these tools that we are giving up was $96,000. The book value of them, however, is $80,000. They had a $200,000 historical cost and $120,000 of depreciation, which means that they are worth $80,000 according to our books. But since we're getting $96,000 in value, we're going to recognize a $16,000 gain on this exchange. Well, there is a $16,000 gain on this exchange. We're not going to recognize the whole thing. What are we going to recognize? Well, how much boot are we receiving? And it's right there. We're receiving boot of $12,000. If we divide that by the total considerations that we are getting, we can figure out what boot's percentage of that total consideration is. Well, what are we getting? We're getting $84,000 press with a fair value of $84,000, and we're getting that $12,000 in cash, which means we're getting $96,000 in total worth of stuff. And if we take $12,000 and we divide it by $96,000, come with 12.5%. So that cash that we're getting represents 12.5% of the total consideration that Axe House is receiving from Hughes Tool Company in this exchange. And we can recognize a portion of that gain that is equal to the portion of the total consideration that we got, which was in the form of boot or cash. $16,000 gain, but we can only recognize 12.5% of it. So if we multiply 12.5% times 16,000, we get 2,000. We can recognize $2,000 worth of gain on this transaction, and we have to defer the remainder. Well, it's $16,000 gain. We're recognizing 2,000, which means we're going to defer the remaining 14,000. The fair value of the press that we're receiving is 84,000, but just like we did before, when you have to defer a gain, you suck it out of the value of the asset that you are acquiring. We're deferring $14,000 worth of gain, which means the basis of this press that we are going to receive is 70 grand. And when we put it on the books, we're going to put it on just like we have before. On December 1st, we're receiving cash. That's the amount of boot we're receiving. That's $12,000. We're getting a piece of equipment, and that piece of equipment, even though it has a fair value of $84,000, and that's what we gave up to get it essentially, we got to suck away $14,000 for that gain that we are deferring. So we're only going to put it on the books for $70,000. Then we got to take off the stuff that we had for these tools that we're giving up in exchange. So let's get rid of their accumulated depreciation. That was $120,000. And let's take the equipment, or the tools in this case, off our books at their historical cost. That was $200,000. And lastly, we're going to recognize that portion of the gain that we're allowed to. And we're only allowed to recognize 12.5% of our $16,000 gain, which was $2,000. So we're going to credit gain on asset disposal for $2,000.